Hi, everyone. This is Talkback. Let's see. It's February 9th, 2021. We've had some tumultuous times this past year, and they're still going on. As we sit here, the impeachment trial of Donald Trump is starting in the Senate, and we are still trying to recover from the COVID that has devastated our country. Um, we're going to turn to another period in our history which was tumultuous. We can argue whether it was more tumultuous or less than what we're living in now, but we have someone who's an author, who's also been trained as an urban planner, who does grant writing and publicity, press for organizations. I'm very happy to welcome Harriet Goodman Grayson. Hi, Harriet.
Thank you for having me. I very much appreciate it. Yes.
Okay, it's great to have you. And we're somewhat compatriots in that we both went to Queens College in the 60s, but I'm somewhat older than you are. I was there from 61 to 65, and you were there from 66 to 70, right?
Correct. Yes.
We'll talk a little bit more about that, but first we'll get some background on your life and how you came to write your new novel, which we want to highlight in this discussion. So tell us a little bit something about yourself. You were born and grew up where?
Well, actually, I was born in Mercy Hospital in Rockville Center, if anybody knows Long Island. And then I stayed here for a few years. We lived with my grandmother. And then we moved to Far Rockaway. And that's where I spent all of my youth. I even went to Queens College while I was still living in Far Rockaway. And then I actually worked in the city at urban planning type jobs. And then I went out to Colorado and I lived there for 8 years. My two daughters were both born in Colorado. And then we decided that we missed our best babysitters, my mother and mother-in-law. And so we journeyed back to East, but not New York City. We decided to move to Connecticut, and we lived outside of Hartford for about 18 years. And during that time, we would summer here in Westerly, Rhode Island. And so in 1999, I purchased a house here in Westerly, and we've been living on and off. And then in 2010, we moved here permanently. And so we've been here since. And part of the reason why I love Westerly is I am a beach bum. It's just like in my blood. And so I've missed my Far Rockaway. I've missed the Rockaway Peninsula. And so I live a little bit, not quite the same, but a little bit closer to that ocean experience. Certainly I have the ocean. I do not have those 10 miles of boardwalk, which is the greatest. I mean, I always think of Rockaway, and I've traveled not a lot, but I've traveled somewhat. And I think that public beach, 10 miles, beautiful wooden boardwalk, all kinds of stores along the way, all kinds of housing developments along the way, crummy roads. It was just magical. That's what I think about it, as having grown up in this magical land. And even in the winter, if you've never been on sand or boardwalk when it's snowing, it's absolutely delightful when you see that kind of snow and the slats on a wooden boardwalk. And that was kind of old and getting a little decrepit even in my day. So when Superstorm Sandy came to the Northeast, it totally destroyed that wooden boardwalk. And it has since been rebuilt, not the same way in many ways. So I'm a planner. I understand directly why you would want better material than simply wood. So it's been rebuilt. But of course, you think when you're a kid, it's not quite the same. It can't possibly be the same. And many of the same people that lived in the Rockaways most of them are gone. And the people who've come to live now in the Rockaways are much different kind of people than the ones that I grew up with.
Right.
And that experience, which was, as I said, absolutely delightful, it became the genesis for my desire to write a book.
Yeah. Well, you expressed so many feelings that I had growing up too. first in the Bronx and then in Little Neck. But I was taught to be a beach bum also. We would take the buses, the subways to Orchard Beach, which I'm sure you know about, and down in Brooklyn to Coney Island, and Brighton Beach was a very, very big attraction for us. And when we had a car, we would go off to either Jones Beach or Rockaway. And the other beach adjacent to Rockaway, Jacob Riis Beach, was also a very great beach with a fabulous surf. Do you remember that?
Yes, and Robert Moses gave us that treat. That was the only treat he gave the Rockaways. I have great feelings, which are not positive, about Robert Moses and what he did to the Rockaways, building all those public housing projects in the middle of sand. But outside of that, yes, yeah, definitely. So Robert, yes, and Playland. I mean, our miniature version
Right.
of Coney Island was Playland, and it was a short bus ride on the Green Line bus. We used to go all the time as kids to go to Playland, which of course doesn't exist anymore.
Right.
But, so we had all these things in miniature, except that the beach and boardwalk was absolutely fantastic. I mean,
Right.
that was not something that was everywhere. And I've since been, of course, to Coney Island and to Brighton Beach. In fact, I have a whole series, 3 books about a police detective, Sasha Perloff, who is Russian born and actually polices the Brighton Beach area. So yes, I take my beaches and my sand very seriously,
Well, that's
and
interesting. Yeah.
use them as background for the novels I write. So
Right.
those novels were written under a pen name, Anastasia, being Russian, Goodman. So, but this book, I wanted to use my real name, Harriet
Okay.
Goodman Grayson, because it was much closer to actually my identity as a person growing up there.
Yeah. So
Versus,
you bring back memories of Brighton Beach, which then became populated by many of the Russian emigres who came from the Soviet Union, and Brighton Beach was a place where they would go. So interesting that you put your character. Well, I think what we're getting to, Harriet, is how much our childhood experiences really still resonate with us today. And one of the things that, we try to tell our children is that we lived through these tumultuous times, which to us were unbelievable. They were cataclysmic. They focused our minds on everything that was happening in the world at that time. We would say that this is history making. And yet we really need to have our children learn and appreciate that. And I think that's kind of what you were trying to get at when you wrote your book, because the 60s were really something in America. So tell me about what your life was like growing up in the 60s in Rockaway.
Well, the 60s were, as we acknowledge, it was the beginning of what we saw in terms of racial unrest. I mean, not that it hadn't been in other parts of the country all over, but one of the things that happened, which was, I think, to this day, detrimental to the Rockaways, has been this idea of putting up all these public housing projects. And what was happening is in the 1950s, we had the Great Migration up from the South of mostly African Americans and poor people who were coming to escape the Jim Crow laws of the South. And some of them came to the Rockaways. And the city of New York was not ready to accept all these migrants. They just really didn't know what to make of them. And so we had that, and we had periods. So as part of being an urban planner, I'm a demographer, so I know about the change in population. And the city of New York was undergoing tremendous stresses. We had this migration from the South. We had migration from Puerto Rico, if anybody remembers West Side Story, that although it's Romeo and Juliet, it also encapsulates the idea of largely Puerto Ricans who are American citizens coming to the New York area. And so we had these twin kind of influences on us. And then the world was just mad. I mean, the world was just mad. We decided, President Johnson, maybe before Eisenhower and maybe Kennedy, decided that there was a war worth fighting in Vietnam. And that's part of the heart of my novel, Rockaway Riptides. And it opens with that as a major point in the history, my personal history, growing up in the Rockaways. And I think a lot of people who may not have grown up in the Rockaways, but experienced what it was like to live during the war in Vietnam. And I won't give away anything in terms of the clues, because I want everybody to go and read this book. But Rockaway Riptides is kind of a double name. Number one, Riptides is looking calm, but underneath is chaos. And that is truly what happens in a water experience with a riptide. And then just the whole idea in the book, it's the name of a rock and roll group. So we had the nice stuff, which was the invasion by the British. And so we had the Beatles and the Rolling Stones and the Animals and the Kinks. And that piece, as I was saying to you off camera, I was trained as a musician. I must admit I was a terrible musician, but my mother was absolutely convinced that I had talent. I don't know why she thought that, but she gave me accordion lessons. I play the clarinet. And so I got clarinet lessons and I played in school. But I really wasn't very good, but I did study it. And I did learn classical music as well as jazz, because the clarinet, and klezmer music, because the clarinet is this incredibly versatile instrument. And that's part of the story, is the characters are part of a rock and roll band. And they're
all right, let's set the stage so that we can give the context of this novel. Do you see it on the screen? Is that the photograph on the cover?
Yes.
Let me ask you this. It's a very attractive cover. Did you have artistic control over how to make the jacket of your book?
I hired someone.
You hired someone.
I hired someone I hired someone to do the cover. I hired someone to be my editor, do the cover, and the interior of the book. Yes.
Okay. And this was something I think that was probably bubbling inside of you for probably a long time, about how you had these stories, these feelings about that period of time, and how you were going to try to do something creative with it, right? When did you start to think about doing something creative with all of this information of that period in time?
Probably about 5 years ago. It starts to germinate in my head. And part of it is the fact that I live here in Westerly, and that big storm Sandy in 2012, really started to get me thinking, oh my gosh, I know what it's like to live through a hurricane. I've lived through a couple of them during my lifetime at the Rockaways. And when I first started my thinking about it, my mother was still alive. She lived to be 99, God bless her. And she and I would have these, as she got older, she also wanted to kind of relive her past. And part of that was this growing, living for so many years in the Rockaways. And so we started to chit-chat about it, about going together with our beach chairs down to the beach, and we would go, and in particular, I remember we would do this actually, so we'd go to Yom Kippur, and of course you're not allowed to eat. My mother was not a religious woman, but she kept to certain rituals for sure, and that was the place we go to escape, just as that photograph is. Right there, sitting on a bench, the ocean is right in front of us, you can smell it for miles, you see the seagulls, they are my friends in the novel, because my mother would always say, don't feed the seagulls, which of course I disregarded and always fed the seagulls, and they were my best buddies. And that was starting to get me to thinking about, oh my gosh, what a paradise that we lived in. And people always say, oh, they remember, well, some people don't remember childhood fondly, but others do, and they always say, oh, they came from the city and they did this or they did that. And I think to myself, not the same. Not the same.
Right. So how far away from the beach did you live?
Oh, within walking distance. Oh, we lived less than a mile away. Absolutely. And then
you graduated from Far Rockaway High School?
Yes, in 1966.
And do you still keep in, aside from the the characters you've created for the novel that we'll talk about, have you kept in touch with your classmates or teachers or over the years?
Not my teachers, but my classmates. Yes, absolutely. There's a whole a group of us who live well, and I used to live outside of Hartford for about 18 years, who lived outside of the Hartford area, and we would actually get together and see each other and reminisce and just reminisce in terms of what we did and what we didn't do and what we wish we had done. But people say this all the time. Youth is wasted on young people because they have absolutely no appreciation until maybe 50 years later. They said, "Oh yeah, that was the coolest thing." Absolutely. Yeah. And I put in the novel many of the experiences that I actually had. So,
okay. So I want to ask you, have you had some of your friends and classmates that you grew up with read the book, and what has been their reaction?
So I have had some of that, and not only did I have relatives. I mean, my uncle, and his daughter had the same high school English teacher from Far Rockaway High School. So we have generations of people who have in the same family who have gone to the school. And people, a couple of people ask me who the characters are. Are they this person or that person? And sometimes I'll tell them, and it's this and that. But it's mostly it's more of a composite of many of the characters. So they'll ask me about that. Who's this? Who's that?
Right. Did you create some of the characters thinking about certain teachers or certain students? Was that something kind of in your mind? Even though you're trying to create an original, you are thinking in your mind about people that you knew who existed back then?
Oh, absolutely. Absolutely. And then I've had, with people that I've kept in contact with, we've had disagreements about how nice or how good they were. Particularly some of the teachers. One of my classmates in particular had a very different opinion about a teacher. But, that's part of being a kid, is that you could have 3 or 4 people who were in the same class with me, and we would walk away with 3 or 4 different opinions about our teacher, because for some reason, when you're young like that, you're very impressionable, I think. And you walk away, and maybe 50, 60 years later, you have this appreciation or a lack of appreciation for who these people actually were. So I did pull in real people, and I brought in some very real incidences that happened at school, which demonstrate what was going on in the outside world, which was not always so kind to us.
So do you have a main character? Is there a protagonist who you could tell us about? We don't want you to give away the whole book, because I imagine you've got a plot and you want everybody to be in some suspense when they take a look at the book and read it, right? But
yes.
Tell us about, do you have a main character, main protagonist? Who is it?
So I have a character whose name is Cecilia Cohen, who I call Cece, because that's the other thing about being high school. I remember kids always had nicknames.
Right.
So yes, and she's a clarinet player, and she lives right there in Wavecrest, which is right on top of the ocean. So yes, there is a main character, and the other thing I'll actually tell you, which is part of it, is that the book opens up because there's something called the Dead Parents Society, and this partially is true. Is about a number of my senior class, not myself, but the senior class, had parents who had passed away before they entered the senior year. So we have this group of 3 kids who form the genesis of much of the activities that go on in the book. And so there's Cece, and then there's her pals, Wayne and Frankie. And these are 3 kids who have lost either a father or a mother. And their reaction to their parents' death actually is not the same. And that's just the way it would be with 3 adults. But in particular with kids, because again, you're impressionable. You don't really know what death is like then you experience it. And I'm not talking about a kid who's 5 years old. I'm talking about 15 and 16-year-olds. And it is, completely traumatizing to lose a parent when you are a teenager and just sort of getting on the cusp of life.
Yeah.
And this person who is significant in your life disappears from your life. And the other thing that's very important is what the war did to people in terms of their it's just something very simple, like as a result of the Vietnam War. When I went to high school, we had a lot of young teachers. We had young men, because it was a deferment, so they didn't have to go to Vietnam.
Right.
So I know that those are minor issues in terms of about the war, but that's one of them. The other thing, of course, is the burning of draft cards, all kinds of demonstrations against President Johnson, who was then the president, because we were talking earlier in 1963, John F. Kennedy is assassinated. That is, in my lifetime, is the most serious thing that ever happened to me ever, is experiencing his death and then what followed after his death. And then in 1968, my novel doesn't go beyond 1966, but of course in 1968, you have Martin Luther King Jr. being assassinated. You have Bobby Kennedy being assassinated. In between, Malcolm X is assassinated. Medgar Evers is assassinated. I mean, all of these national figures are murdered, and we are seeing this. And I make it especially poignant because these three characters, not only do they, nobody knew John Kennedy, who I went to school with, but they have that experience coupled with the experience of their own parent dying. So it is just, and sometimes just overwhelming for kids who have gone through this kind of stuff. And that's part of the novel, the whole angst of being a teenager caught up in events which you have absolutely nothing to do with and have no control over.
Right. Well, you highlight some of the tumultuous things that were happening in the 60s. And you're right, starting with that 1963 assassination of John F. Kennedy. That was one of the most tragic and cataclysmic things that happened, that set in motion civil rights movement, Johnson becoming president, Johnson taking over the Vietnam War, Johnson not running for president because the war was so unpopular, Robert F. Kennedy, Kennedy's brother, senator from New York, who, by the way, Harriet, was the commencement speaker at my Queens College graduation in 1965, Senator Robert F. Kennedy. And then the whole civil rights movement that Johnson put forward while he was doing Vietnam, it was a kind of a schizophrenic thing that we were going through all during those 60s. I mean, these are things that I'm sure kind of made it into your book, but how did you get the connection between what your Cecilia was going through, the fact that she had lost a parent, and then all the tragedies of that era? How did you try to connect that with what was happening in the world?
Well, I think with my character, because even though I state that I was a terrible musician, music has always been very much a part of my life. And so I use music as the thread that binds these kids together and gives them strength and a future, so that they, even though none of them would probably become professional musicians, it was a thread. And in fact, it was a thread in the 1960s. We had Kennedy gets murdered in 63. The Beatles come to America in 64. And I was one of those people that stood in front of the Plaza Hotel in 1964 when the Beatles were staying there. So you have, that's the sweetness that comes and tries to smooth away some of the hurt and some of the things that you cannot control. But you can control what you do in a rock and roll band. To some extent, you can control what you do in an orchestra while you're playing Mozart. So that's the glue that I used, and in fact was true. I mean, that was part of what I did growing up, very much in terms of music being the thing that really defined my growing up. Even though, believe me, there was no orchestra in the world that was ever going to hire me. But it's still something that you learn and you concentrate and you focus on, and that's kind of soothes and alleviates some of the hurt. So, and that you have control over, and that's what I put in there as music, which for me personally was the thing that helped all over those bumpy times.
Well, without getting into the exact plot and the storyline, can you tell us what Cecilia, what her conflict was, other than where she was in history and the fact that she had lost a parent? What is the conflict, the kind of the plot device that you're using to move the novel along? What's going to happen to her? How is she going to change as she goes through your creation?
Well, one part is she has this new rock and roll band, and you see the band as it progresses over the. It's only it's 1 year. It's a senior year of high school, 65 to 66, and so you see this band being created and how it's performing and where it performs, and you see Cece's actual maturation as a person through music in terms of what she's asked to do as a musician, and so that kind of points them along in terms of where they're going. And then it's the whole college process about applying to colleges and getting help from your relatives, from the school, and then actually going for visits to see colleges. Cece will, in fact, in the novel, does apply to a music school. So, of course, she is required to go to an audition and what the audition is all about. So we follow that thread, and as the kids go through the senior year, and the senior year for us was as crazy as the world outside was going on. So we used to have. It's not in the book, but I'll give you an example. So my class, when you went to Far Rockaway High School, there were a couple of things that were absolutely required. Number one, because we lived by the water, and our principal, who had been there for many, many years, required that all of us, every single one, could not graduate from high school unless you could swim and you could pass a life-saving test. So that was number one. That's part of the book, because that was absolutely required. So you had to do that, and there was this push to be able to pass a algebra regents exam, even among the dunderheads, because again, our principal thought that was a thing to do, that no kid was that stupid that they couldn't, with some help, pass a regents exam. And then there was the way the system was set out in New York City public school system. I'm sure you might have gone through that system, so you know what I'm talking about. When you went to high school, you had three options. One was the Regents diploma, where you took these statewide tests. The second one was, and mostly girls were in this, commercial diploma, where the girls studied typing and shorthand and things of that. And then there was the general diploma for kids who largely was boys who didn't seem to find any place to go in high school. They were sort of academically lost souls. They could have been athletes. They could have done other things, but they were academically out in the forest. So that was the way the whole system was worked, and I use that as something to show how there are different kids in the high school. And Cece, because she's a musician, she knows a lot of these kids, even though she may not go to class with them, is because music is the thing that binds them together, and it's all kinds of music. And number one, I chose the clarinet because I played it, so I know what I'm talking about. But secondly, and the reason I did not pick it because of this reason, I picked it because it was easy to carry on the bus. That's the honest truth about how I chose that instrument to begin with. But in the book, I talk about how, and now as an adult I see, its versatility as an instrument. So that allows Cece to try to play klezmer music with her Uncle Jack, play in the orchestra, play in the marching band, and then also play in the high school musical. So that's, and many of the kids and the characters are kids who are part of this music scene, one of the music scenes. It doesn't have to be, a kid who played the trumpet for Kennedy's assassination. Is not someone who played in may have not played in the orchestra, but he might have been in the marching band. So there's, that kind of, so it's the music, which in the 1960s as a kid was in fact very important to me.
All right. So if I asked you what is, I know you're telling me about the characters, the importance of the music, the importance of Cece commingling with all the different kinds of students academically in the school, how music kind of brings them together. I get all that. I'm still trying to figure out what is like the thesis of the book. What are you trying to get us to learn or to know, or what's in your heart that you need to get out to tell us through this book and through these characters? I'm still searching for that.
I think it's the vulnerability of being young, that you really don't have real control, but you have to, you have to make do. And there was, depending on, what kind of diploma you had, there were all kinds of expectations as you went through the system. So the expectation was that I and my character, graduate from elementary school, go to junior high school instead of 3 years, go to it in 2 years. So we're young. I'm young, and the characters are young because many of them are fellow passengers along that route. And I just think it's the vulnerability, how kids are just caught up in stuff they have no control of. And I see that, even today, when you look around the Black Lives Matter kind of movement, some of the crazy stuff with the QAnon people, it's this kind of, I don't have control. So how am I going to succeed in life? And Cece becomes a success. And some of the kids do not become successes. They don't necessarily become musicians or not musicians, but there's some dark stuff in there. And that dark stuff was part of being young. And again, as I say, not in control, but you got to get through the day and you got to get through the school year. And then there's a bright future, maybe in the next step over. And I actually, I envision that through all my characters. Some of them don't make it through the school year, but some of them will, and they'll become smarter and lay the seeds for becoming successful. And that's probably the measure that you can find yourself and find yourself a future, a promising future, regardless of the chaos for which you cannot have any control. And I think that's and it's a message for adults, not only for kids.
Right.
And if you live through crazy times like we're living now, you say, oh my God, what could there be? But there's a light at the end of the tunnel. And it's, I give the book, I'll tell you this, a sweet ending, because that's my point, that the future, even though it might be seemingly crazy and you can't do anything about it, ultimately, as you get to be an adult, you actually do take over some of this control.
Will we see some moments of suspense or decision making where we don't know which way someone is going to go, and that's going to be something that's going to be an exciting thing to turn the page to find out? Any kind of suspenseful stuff like that?
Well, it's not suspenseful the way I write mysteries. That's truly suspenseful. Who's the murderer? You don't get this kind of thing. But I mean, I think there's some. The ending itself, I think, is unexpected. So that I think is the ultimate, the bottom. When you finish the page, you probably were not expecting what happened. So that's the suspense. But it builds up in terms of just what happens during the senior year is so very important to kids. Even kids who especially during those times, the boys who didn't go to college or go anywhere after high school, they were caught up in some very, very difficult decision making. So there is some of that suspense about, they're all supposedly going to college, even the dunderheads. and then something derails some of that thinking. So there's that. And then it's the and in some sense, I think it's kind of the futility of all the protesting. Having lived through the protesting, the war ended when Nixon wanted to end it. He could have ended that war, the Vietnam War, in 1968 when he took over after Johnson decided not to run for president again. But he didn't. He didn't, because he milked it for what it was worth for him politically. So there are things that could have changed that didn't change, and my characters are caught up in these events that happen. And the other thing that happens, which I also talk about in the book, which is the fact that the school system, the Board of Education, and its relationship to the students and their parents also changed. And that's captured very much in the book. And so and this is, based on my own experiences. So our longtime principal is forced to retire because that's the way the system is. And she was a member of our community. She was a woman who came up from the 1930s, an Irish single woman, went through the system. You might have had these Irish women who particularly your elementary school teachers, and they were in the system. They came in the 30s. They were talking about the 60s. 30 years later, some of them went up to become principals and assistant principals, and there's that progress up. Well, in the mid 60s, that stuff starts to change, and part of that is the fact that the school system didn't really know what to do about the migration from the 1950s of African Americans and the kids from Puerto Rico coming in. They didn't really know how to deal with those kids. And so the system starts to fray. And the people that come up later, the new principal of the school that opens up this book, is someone who is not from the community, did not go to church or go to the stores in downtown Far Rockaway. He's not part of this system. He's part of the bureaucratic system. And that bureaucratic system and the parents will actually go to war with each other, not with guns, but with words, will go to war with each other in the 1960s as the Board of Education fails in its mission to educate a lot of school kids. And I capture that because that to me was very important to me as an adult thinking back on it. Because in 1965, there is a very important mayor election. If you remember New York City, Robert Wagner had been our mayor. I had been our mayor for years, and that's the way the system went. And in 1965, Abe Beame, who's a Democrat, goes against John Lindsay, who was an extremely handsome, tall Republican from the Upper East Side of Manhattan. And then the third party candidate is Buckley, the crazy conservative. And I talk about that, and I talk about that in terms of how that changed the city, and it changed Rockaways, because a lot of people didn't like Lindsay. In fact, that's one of the comments I get back. But after I graduated from Queens College, actually went to work for the Lindsay administration. So I have this great respect and actually admiration. He was a failed mayor, but his heart was in the right place. And I kind of picked that up in terms of the book because that's what I actually lived. And when his term ended and Abe Beame was elected, I actually left New York City and went to Colorado.
Okay.
I basically gave up on New York City.
All right. So let me summarize what I think I've learned. So Rockaway Riptides. You use the experiences you had growing up in Far Rockaway and going to that high school. You talk about characters who are similar to the ones you knew about, the educators, and you weave it in as a coming of age story for Cecilia, who's a musician and a student, and you weave that together with all of the events that are happening in the 60s that are transforming our society, our politics, our way we kind of look at each other. The war issue of Vietnam was a huge factor in people's lives in the 60s. So I think you're trying to put it all in a package, coming of age during tumultuous times. So I think that kind of sums it up. I'm going to put the the jacket up one more time so people can see Rockaway Riptides. And I wish you every success with the book.
And the back cover is actually my graduation photo.
What? Oh, it's your graduation photo. Wow, the back cover. Let's take a look at that.
Yeah,
Okay.
yeah.
Oh, that's great, from your yearbook. Wonderful. Well, all the best to you with this book.
Thank you.
And,
Thank you.
we'll see you again and for many other discussions. And we'll be telling people how important the 60s were in the development of our political history, that the events of today are exciting, but the years that we grew up in New York City in the 60s are unmatchable in history almost, right? Almost.
Absolutely. Just thankfully, we don't have the assassinations that we lived through.
Okay. Pray for that, of course.
Yes,
okay.
yes.
All right. So thank you, Harriet Goodman Grayson. We'll see you next time on Talkback. Bye.
Thank you.
Okay.